Here's a question that sounds deceptively simple, right up until you actually start pulling gently on the thread, and it slowly unravels into something far more complicated than expected. Did ancient humans have one partner? It's a question that manages to be evolutionary, anthropological, philosophical, and intensely personal all at once, depending entirely on who's asking and why. And the honest answer, once you actually dig into the biology, the archaeology, the primate comparisons, and the cross cultural anthropological record, turns out to be the kind of answer that satisfies absolutely nobody completely on either side of the debate, which, in most fields of honest inquiry, is usually a fairly decent sign that it's actually accurate. The short version is basically yes, generally speaking, with substantial and genuinely important variation built directly into that answer. And the very concept of one partner, the way most of us casually understand it today, is quietly carrying a lot of hidden assumptions that genuinely need unpacking before the question even makes coherent sense. That longer, considerably more nuanced explanation is exactly what this entire video is actually about. Start with biology, because the body keeps a record of what our ancestors were doing even when they left behind no other documentation. Whether a species practices monogamy, polygyny, or something else entirely is a question evolutionary biologists can actually assess from physical characteristics alone because different mating systems create different selection pressures that leave different anatomical signatures behind. The anatomy functions as a kind of fossil record of reproductive behavior, preserved directly in body structure long after the individuals and their specific choices are gone. In species with strong polygyny, where one male mates with many females and male-male competition for access is intense, males tend to grow significantly larger than females since bigger males win more fights and post more reproductive success, creating steady selection pressure for size over generations. Gorillas are the textbook example. Male gorillas run roughly twice the body mass of females, reflecting a system where dominant males hold exclusive access to multiple females and compete violently for it, sometimes fighting rivals to the point of serious injury or death, a cost the system tolerates because the reproductive payoff for the winning male is so large. In strictly monogamous species, by contrast, male and female body size tends to land close to identical since there's no size advantage to be gained from male-male competition when each male pairs with just one female regardless of fighting ability. Now look at humans. The average human male runs roughly 15 to 20% heavier and 5 to 7% taller than the average human female. A moderate degree of sexual size difference, noticeably more than you'd expect from a strictly monogamous species, but noticeably less than you'd expect from a strongly polygynous one like gorillas. The biology points towards something sitting between strict monogamy and strong polygyny, not one and not the other, something genuinely in between. Testis size relative to body size offers a second biological clue, and arguably a more revealing one. In species where females routinely mate with multiple males in rapid succession, sperm from different males ends up competing directly inside the female reproductive tract, creating pressure for males to produce more sperm, which shows up as larger testes relative to body size. Chimpanzees, with their highly promiscuous mating system, where multiple males mate with the same female in quick succession, carry enormous testes relative to their overall body size, sperm competition, written directly into the anatomy. Gorillas, whose females mate exclusively with a single dominant male, carry small testes relative to body size, since there's no competition driving sperm production volume upward. Human testis size sits between these two extremes, larger than a gorilla's, suggesting some real sperm competition occurred across our evolutionary past, and smaller than a chimpanzee's, suggesting we were never nearly as promiscuous as they are. The anatomy points, again, toward an intermediate, mixed system, not strictly monogamous, not highly promiscuous, something that resists mapping cleanly onto either extreme. Sperm morphology adds a smaller but genuinely interesting third data point here. Researchers studying comparative sperm competition across primates have found that species with intense sperm competition also tend to produce sperm with higher rates of variability in shape and swimming speed within a single ejaculate, since a mix of faster, more mobile sperm, alongside other forms, may help outcompete rival sperm inside a shared reproductive tract. Human sperm shows a moderate, intermediate level of this same variability, again landing well short of chimpanzee levels, but clearly above what you'd expect in a species with zero history of sperm competition whatsoever. Put the biology together and you get a consistent picture. Homo sapiens evolved inside a mating context that was neither strictly monogamous nor highly promiscuous, but something messier and more variable than either clean category allows. The real question is what that messier reality actually looked like in practice. And for that, we need the anthropological evidence from real human societies across history and around the world. The cross-cultural anthropological record is genuinely illuminating and somewhat inconvenient for anyone hoping for a clean, tidy answer they can quote in a single sentence. Across the several hundred documented human societies compiled in resources like the Standard Cross-Cultural Sample and the Ethnographic Atlas throughout the 20th century, roughly 80 to 85% formally permit polygyny, a man having more than one wife simultaneously. That statistic gets cited constantly as proof that polygyny is humanity's natural mating system and strict monogamy is a cultural imposition working against our biology. But the number needs real context, and without it, it's actively misleading. Permitting polygyny isn't the same as practicing it universally, or even commonly. In most societies that formally allow it, the majority of actual pairings remain monogamous in practice. Polygyny, where it occurs, concentrates heavily among high-status men who can actually afford to attract and support multiple wives, and most men throughout most of human history simply didn't have those resources. Legal or cultural permission and actual lived practice are reliably different things, and treating them as identical distorts the whole picture. The distribution of mating systems across documented societies isn't a random sample of every possible human arrangement either. Heavily polygynous societies tend to be stratified ones, pastoral or agricultural societies where wealthy men can accumulate enough surplus to support several wives. Hunter-gatherer societies, which represent the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, both in raw time and in the environment that actually shaped our evolved psychology, show much lower rates of polygyny than agricultural societies do. Looking specifically at the societies most similar to the environment human mating systems actually evolved in, the pattern shifts substantially towards something closer to flexible monogamy with occasional variation. And roughly 15 to 20% of documented societies formally practice monogamy as a cultural norm, not a trivially small number. And enough independent appearances across unrelated cultures, from parts of pre-colonial East Asia to certain indigenous North American societies to much of pre-industrial Europe, to suggest monogamy isn't purely a modern Western import, but a recurring human solution that different societies arrived at separately in response to broadly similar social pressures rather than through shared cultural inheritance. What problems does monogamy actually solve? This is where the evolutionary logic gets genuinely interesting. One influential theory, developed by researchers including anthropologist Joseph Henrich and laid out in detail in his book The Weirdest People in the World, holds that socially enforced monogamy emerged specifically as a solution to the problems created by wildly unequal reproductive success among men. In strongly polygynous systems, high-status men monopolize reproductive access, leaving large numbers of lower-status men without partners at all. Groups of unpartnered men with little to lose and a lot to gain from risky, competitive behavior are historically and cross-culturally bad news for social stability, prone to more fighting, more risk-taking, and more disruption of collective cooperation. Monogamous norms reduce the variance in male reproductive success, giving lower-status men access to partners they wouldn't have in a fully polygynous system, which lowers their incentive for disruptive competition and raises their investment in the group's collective welfare. Cross-cultural data backs this up, with societies enforcing stronger monogamy norms tending to show lower rates of male-on-male violence and higher levels of paternal investment in children. Henrich's broader argument connects this directly to large-scale social outcomes, proposing that societies which shifted toward enforced monogamy gained a genuine competitive advantage: more men with a real stake in group stability, more cooperative labor pooling, and lower ongoing rates of status-driven male violence, advantages that compounded over generations, and may help explain why monogamous norms spread and persisted even in the absence of any centralized authority forcing the shift. Monogamy also addresses a very specific practical problem: paternity uncertainty. A man in an exclusive relationship enforced by real social pressure can be considerably more confident a child is genuinely his, and higher paternity confidence tends to produce more paternal investment, which tends to produce better outcomes for children. None of this makes monogamy biologically inevitable or some universal default. It makes monogamy a social technology, a set of cultural rules and enforcement mechanisms that emerged repeatedly and independently because it solves real coordination problems. It's invented, not innate, but things that are invented can still work extremely well, and needing enforcement doesn't make something unnatural. If any of that has reframed how you think about the word natural, stick around, because the genetic evidence gets even stranger. And if you're finding this kind of deep dive worthwhile, go ahead and subscribe now. Now let's look at what actually happened in practice. Since social norms and real human behavior reliably diverge in every society ever studied, genetic evidence offers one important window into historical mating patterns through Y-chromosome studies, which trace the male line through direct father-to-son transmission. Researcher Patricia Balaresque and colleagues identified several so-called Y-chromosome star clusters, sudden bursts of shared male line ancestry, consistent with a small number of men fathering an outsized share of descendants within specific historical windows, including one dated to roughly 4 to 5,000 years ago, associated with the Eurasian steppe. It's worth being precise here, since popular media frequently conflates different star cluster findings. The most famous individual case, a single lineage traced to somewhere between 16 and 19 million living male line descendants today, is separately and more specifically associated with research by geneticist Tatiana Zergel and colleagues tracing a lineage roughly 800 years old across Central Asia, widely popularized as connected to Genghis Khan's dynasty specifically, a distinct finding from the older stepwide star clusters Balaresque's team documented. Either way, the underlying genetic signature isn't random variation across a large population. It reflects a social system where some men achieved dramatically more reproductive success than others, consistent with the kind of stratified polygyny historically associated with mobile pastoralist warrior societies operating across large, resource-variable territories. Some men fathered many children across many women. Many men fathered none at all, an outcome that maps directly onto the earlier point about unpartnered men and social instability. Since a pastoralist steppe society with exactly this kind of skewed reproductive access would have carried a correspondingly large population of young men with genuinely little personal stake in group cohesion. Studies of ancient DNA from Neolithic agricultural sites across Europe show a similar pattern: fewer distinct male lineages than female lineages, contributing to the following generation, suggesting the transition to agriculture and heritable wealth increased male reproductive inequality rather than reducing it. Once you can own land and livestock and pass them down to sons, the material foundation for polygyny expands dramatically, and the genetics of the populations that followed reflect exactly that. Hunter-gatherer populations, studied through both ancient DNA and direct contemporary observation, show meaningfully lower male reproductive inequality, consistent with the theoretical expectation, since in societies with limited individual wealth accumulation and strong norms of resource sharing, the material basis for polygyny is structurally constrained from the start. It's worth being honest that this genetic evidence, while genuinely informative, comes with real limits of its own. Ancient DNA samples are unevenly distributed across regions and time periods, skewed toward sites with favorable preservation conditions, meaning the overall picture is built from a real but incomplete patchwork of evidence rather than a comprehensive global survey. And researchers continue actively revising specific timelines and magnitude estimates as new samples get sequenced. Across all of this evidence, one pattern holds consistently. People formed primary pair bonds, a recognized, stable relationship between two specific individuals, involving mutual investment, shared living arrangements, and shared responsibility for offspring, appears to be a genuine human behavioral universal. The neurochemical architecture behind it, the oxytocin and vasopressin systems that generate attachment and a specific preference for one individual over others, is real, biologically well understood, and clearly the product of a long evolutionary history. It evolved because it worked. Pairs that genuinely stayed together over the long haul tended to raise more surviving children than pairs that didn't, across enough generations to gradually shape the emotional architecture of human attachment itself into what it is today. But the pair bond coexisted with behavior outside the pair bond, in both directions and both sexes, across virtually every human society ever documented. The genetic evidence for sperm competition, the intermediate testis size, and cross cultural documentation of extra pair relationships all point toward the same conclusion. Humans formed primary pair bonds and, at meaningful rates, also maintained or pursued relationships outside those bonds. The pair bond was, statistically and socially, the modal relationship, the expected default structure across essentially every human group ever studied, but it wasn't always exclusive in practice, even in places where it was clearly expected to be exclusive in theory. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies consistently document rates of extra-pair relationships that are real and significant without being dominant, and these relationships typically weren't random or opportunistic. Some traditional Amazonian societies practice something anthropologists call partible paternity, documented extensively by researchers Stephen Beckerman and Paul Valentine, a belief system in which more than one man can be socially recognized as having contributed biologically to a single child, each expected to provide some measure of support. It's a genuinely striking, well-documented example of how flexibly some human societies have organized paternity and partnership around lived social reality rather than around strict biological exclusivity, showing the space between faithful monogamy and unconstrained promiscuity is more textured and more socially structured than either simple story suggests. It's also worth noting partible paternity isn't practiced identically everywhere it appears. Some documented Amazonian groups apply it broadly across most children, while others reserve it for specific circumstances, and anthropologists continue debating exactly what ecological or social conditions make a society more likely to adopt this kind of arrangement in the first place, rather than a strictly exclusive pairing model. Individual variation matters here too, a dimension formal evolutionary models tend to underplay, since they describe populations and averages, while real variation around those averages was substantial and consequential. In any hunter-gatherer population, some individuals leaned strongly toward long-term exclusive attachment, others toward multiple, simultaneous, or sequential relationships. Some men invested heavily as fathers, others far less. Some women prioritized security and reliable provisioning in a partner. Others prioritized different qualities entirely. That variation wasn't statistical noise. It was part of the system itself, and it's a large part of why human mating arrangements across cultures stay genuinely variable rather than converging on one universal pattern. This variation also has a clear generational and situational dimension. The same individual might behave quite differently in early adulthood, actively seeking status and multiple partners, versus later in life once children and established relationships raise the practical cost of disruption, meaning individual mating strategy wasn't necessarily a fixed trait, so much as a flexible response shifting across a person's own lifespan and circumstances. Jealousy offers one of the clearest windows into the ancestral mating system, since jealousy is an evolved psychological response to a specific threat, losing a partner or a partner's investment to a rival. Psychologist David Buss's research on jealousy, first published in the early 1990s, found a consistent cross-cultural pattern showing up across dozens of societies. Men tend to report more intense jealousy in response to sexual infidelity, specifically the possibility a partner has had sex with someone else, while women tend to report more intense jealousy in response to emotional infidelity, specifically the possibility a partner has formed deep emotional attachment elsewhere. Evolutionary theory predicts exactly this split. Based on the different reproductive stakes each type of infidelity historically carried for each sex, sexual infidelity, risking a man investing resources in a child that isn't biologically his; emotional infidelity, risking a woman losing her partner's resources and attention to another woman and her offspring entirely. It's worth flagging that this particular finding has become genuinely contested territory within psychology. Several later replication attempts across different methodologies and cultural samples have produced inconsistent results, with some researchers arguing the sex difference is real but modest, and others arguing it may be shaped more by relationship context and cultural framing than by any hardwired evolutionary module. The debate remains active rather than settled, and it's a genuinely good illustration of how evolutionary psychology findings that sound tidy and intuitive in a first study often turn out to be considerably messier. Once dozens of independent research teams try to reproduce them under different conditions. Female mate choice deserves real emphasis too, a dimension earlier evolutionary accounts systematically underweighted. Women in hunter-gatherer societies were never passive recipients of whatever outcome male competition produced. They exercised active preferences, formed alliances supporting those preferences, resisted pairings that didn't serve their interests, and pursued relationships aligned with their own goals. Female preference in these societies tends to favor men combining physical capability with social skill and demonstrated generosity, a genuine willingness to share resources and invest reliably over time, a combination that's genuinely hard to fake inside a small group where everyone observes everyone else constantly. Women in small bands had access to detailed, accumulated information about potential partners' actual behavior across a wide range of conditions, arguably making their mate choices considerably better informed than they could realistically be inside a large, anonymous modern society, where a first date or a curated online profile often has to substitute for years of directly observed, real behavior across genuine hardship and cooperation. The universality of marriage, as an institution, points in the same direction as everything else. Some culturally recognized, publicly acknowledged form of partnership, carrying mutual obligations, distinct from purely casual sexual relationships, shows up in every human culture ever documented, even though the specific forms vary enormously. You embed a behavior into formal social structure precisely when it's important enough to require social management, and when individuals left entirely to their own devices wouldn't always behave in ways that serve collective interests. The fact that every human culture independently developed some form of marriage suggests the underlying pair bond is genuinely real and deep enough to require formal recognition, and also fragile enough to require ongoing structural support, since a purely biological drive strong enough to stand entirely on its own presumably wouldn't need laws, ceremonies, and social sanction reinforcing it in every single culture that has ever existed. So, did ancient humans have one partner? Ancient humans predominantly had one primary partner at a time. The pair bond was real, emotionally significant, functionally important, and present in every documented human society. At the same time, that bond typically wasn't exclusive in the strict way modern monogamous ideals define exclusivity. Extra pair relationships happened, were socially managed rather than simply absent, and left real traces in both the genetic record and the cross-cultural anthropological documentation of virtually every society ever studied. Evolutionary biologists sometimes describe the human mating system, somewhat inelegantly but accurately, as facultative monogamy with variation. The default is a recognized pair bond built around one primary partner. The system stays flexible enough to accommodate real variation in both directions depending on circumstance, status, and culture. That's not a comfortable answer for anyone hoping the biology would straightforwardly vindicate their preferred social arrangement. It doesn't validate strict monogamy as the only natural human configuration, and it doesn't endorse non-monogamy as some pure evolutionary baseline that modern culture corrupted. What it tells everyone equally is that the evidence is genuinely complicated, the history is genuinely complicated, and human sexual behavior has always been considerably more variable than any single, simple story can fully capture. The pair bond is real. Exclusivity is variable. The specific shape of any given human partnership gets negotiated between biology, culture, and circumstance in ways that resist easy generalization and have resisted it for as long as humans have been forming partnerships and arguing, sometimes passionately, about exactly what those partnerships should look like, which, if you've ever actually been in a long-term relationship yourself, is probably not remotely news to you.